Frisco, a hidden gem on Lakeshore Drive and 19th Street.
All right, Sam Kahn, senior writer at The Athletic, covering college football, recruiting in Texas, and much more. In fact, he's a University of Houston alum as well. Sam Kahn Jr. joins us on SicEm365 Radio. We've had him on many times before. Sam, everything now is out in the open after what Brent Realignment reported last week, and now it's all kind of fallen into place. What is the next a brick to fall, or what's the next expansion move, you think, in America, in college football?
I think it's figuring out what happens with the other 8 schools in the Big 12, because the other conferences don't have to make a move at this point, I don't think. The Big 10 certainly doesn't, because it's in a comparable financial situation to the SEC. The next most vulnerable league of the power conferences is the Pac-12. So if anybody was to make a move, I would expect they would be the next one. But the Big 12, obviously, I think is the thing that we're all watching is what do the remaining 8 schools do? Do they try to latch on to these other leagues and in hopes of keeping media rights revenue comparable to what it is now, or are they going to hang on and try to expand themselves? That's what I'm most interested in moving forward.
What do you think is the best move for the Big 12? Do you think that they can do anything to really up their value at all now?
If they hold together and expand, I don't think there's anything they can do to recoup the revenue they're going to lose from Texas, Oklahoma. I just don't think the candidates to bring into the league are out there that would be willing to go. I think the remaining 8 schools' best shot of keeping the money similar is getting into their league. Whether, if it's West Virginia to the ACC or several of these teams going to the Pac-12, whatever it is, that's the best shot. The question is do those leagues feel that those Big 12 teams bring enough value that it will raise everybody else's value? Because that's ultimately the decision that has to be made by the conferences. Do you increase value for the rest of the members of the conference? If you do, then it makes sense to add you. That's what's driving the bus on these decisions at this point.
Sam, I saw Pac-12 had their media days. New commissioner George Kliavkoff said that the Pac-12 is, going to be proactive, and they're, it seems like kind of already a little bit of a difference from the Larry Scott era. Was there anything else notable or anything notable from the Pac-12 side of things today, as far as additional thoughts on kind of the landscape of college football right now?
Yeah, just the fact that he was coy as you would expect him to be. That they're interesting because he's a new commissioner and he's not from the general college football establishment, and so he's not necessarily going to think of things the same way as everybody else. And that's what fascinates me about it. It's why it's so hard to predict what the Pac-12 may do. We can't just say, well, no, they won't add any of these schools, because we don't know. We don't know. The one thing that he stuck out to me that George said was, we're going to do the best we can to make sure we optimize the number of teams that we get into the college football playoff. And that's a little bit different from the old company line, under the Larry Scott era. And I think that's important, because if this is the realignment structure and we remain with this 12-team playoff proposal that we're looking at, then for the teams outside the SEC, yes, the SEC is going to get a lot of teams in, but you still are going to have the highest 6th-ranked conference champions if they keep the format as it is. And so that stands to reason the Pac-12 probably gets a team in. And then figuring out how you get those multiple teams in, those other teams in, is a priority. So if he can figure out what combination of teams you could bring in to optimize that, it makes a ton of sense. And that's what makes it a little bit unpredictable on what they may do.
Sam, you were at Big 12 Media Days. You saw the tone and heard Bob Bowlesby, and we had him on our show. And how could he have not known something? I
mean, none of us knew anything until about 2:30 on Wednesday afternoon. That before Jimbo Fisher got on the mic at SEC Media Days. That is, I think, the thing that is most fascinating to me is the amount of restraint that are required for the people involved in this to not let the cat out of the bag early. Because by the time it was leaked before SEC Media Days, we were clearly already pretty far down the track, because this thing is going to wrap up probably by the end of this week. And that is rare, I think, in this instance. And The only other time I've seen it recently was with the College Football Playoff Expansion Committee meetings. Those meetings have been going on for some time too, and they were able to restrain themselves from leaking that out as well. It is tough. It looks bad on Bowlesby, certainly, but he shared a lot of those meeting rooms during that working committee on the College Football Playoff with Greg Sankey. So do you blame Bob Bowlesby for not knowing? Do you blame Greg Sankey for doing this all the while? Texas and Oklahoma clearly have been operating in the shadows as well. Bowlesby obviously looks bad with the comments. I mean, those comments that I'm not losing sleep over realignment, it looks bad in retrospect. But the more we find out about how this unfolded, it doesn't seem like a lot of people knew up until last week. So I think it's easy to make him a target, but at the same time, I think we all were shocked by this news, and it was pretty stunning for all of us.
To that end, Sam, do you think that this was kind of approached kind of like for lack of a better metaphor, like a SEAL team? You don't have Texas and OU aren't going to inform 40 people about this. This is a mission that has to get completed. We need 10 people on this. That's it. Right. And that's the only way you can keep this a secret.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. You have to keep a small, tight, trustworthy circle on something like this. And who knows how long it's been. I know I've seen different reports flying out there on how long it's been, but it's clearly something like this can't happen over the course of a week or two. It certainly has to have been at least a few months. And so, like I said, it's impressive because people like to talk, and especially something of this magnitude. And here's one thing I would say, too, about this. It is stunning to all of us that this happened, at least when it did. But one thing I have heard from talking to people around the industry in the last week is that we knew this day was going to come because of the grant of rights expiring in 2025. We just didn't think it was going to come now. I certainly didn't think it. I thought we would be looking at 2023 maybe is when those schools or any schools in the Big 12 would start to look ahead to the next cycle. We thought we'd be a little bit closer to the end of the grant of rights and the broadcast contract before this happened. The fact that this happened now, I think, is what's so stunning. And the reason I think it happened now is I go back to the discussions the Big 12 had in May with ESPN and Fox. And when ESPN and Fox gave a tepid response to renegotiating the broadcast contract, only 5 months after ESPN gave a $3 billion 10-year deal to the SEC, I think to me that put Oklahoma and Texas on high alert of where the Big 12 sat in the pecking order in the eyes of the broadcast networks, and they probably acted accordingly.
Sam, obviously, man, there's so many rumors out there and so much speculation and people just guessing. Everybody's got a source and all that. But one story that has caught my interest is just the apparent talks between the Pac-10 and the Pac-12 and the Big Ten. Some alluding to, possibly the Big Ten poaching some teams or an all-out scheduling alliance. What are your thoughts on those two potentially working together in some form or fashion?
Because of their relationship through the Rose Bowl, if any leagues were going to work together, those two make sense. I would anticipate it's more of a scheduling alliance than anything. I think I would be a little bit surprised if the Big Ten were to poach teams from the Pac-12 just because of the geographic fit. And I know in realignment, geography seems to be secondary at this point, but that is a pretty drastic change, especially when you're coming from the West Coast and you have to travel for road games. So I don't know that I would anticipate the Big Ten poaching those members, but a scheduling alliance certainly could make some sense. Definitely the expansion candidates at this point for those types of conferences, I think, are not the kind of ones that move the needle. The pickings are slim. So if there's not no-brainers out there to be had, which there are only a few, but they're far-fetched. Like Notre Dame, one of those teams that you would, if you're the Big Ten, you would love to get. But I mean, how realistic is that? They certainly seem happy with their independence. But outside of any of those no-brainers, you probably have to be creative to counteract this. And I think the thing that's important is I think people need to be measured and thorough in how they approach this. This is not something I think that needs to be a whiplash decision. And certainly when we go back to the Big 12, they've got time, I think, to figure this out, depending on how long it's going to take for OU and Texas to get out. But this is not something that has to be decided tomorrow. It just seems like it because of the immediacy of the news.
That's a great point because everyone wants to know now. Like, my God, we're in the time of immediacy and instant gratification.
Well, and you're also talking about people who have like a big part of their life hanging in the balance as far as their fandom and their university. That's why it's personal for people.
Yeah, it is. And it's because we don't know when Texas OU eventually buy themselves out or buy their way out or what happens, it doesn't mean that Oklahoma State, Tech, Baylor, and TCU or whoever else have to have an answer by the weekend. And that's just not how we work in America. That's just, that's not the way we work. And I get it quite a bit. Well, in the end, Sam, will it be 4 16 conferences plus maybe Notre Dame or Brigham Young? Is that what we're headed for? Or maybe 3 20-team conferences with a handful of whoever is independent?
Some power structure that makes that big line of demarcation between the powers and the non-powers, I think, is what we're headed towards. Whether that's 4 of 16 or 3 of 20 or whatever, who's to say? One thing I will say is that when talking to people around the sport in the last week, one thing is clear is that this is not the end. And I don't mean for realignment. I mean that we're probably headed towards a different world in college football. And when I say that, I mean the governance structure. Like maybe college football is no longer under the NCAA umbrella in a few years. I think that's kind of where this is steering that toward. I don't know exactly what it looks like exactly, but to me, it becomes clear. We had that conversation earlier this year, but the European Soccer Super League that was created and then quickly dissolved. We may actually be heading towards something like that in college football, where it's only a few dozen teams that are at the top of the power structure, and then everybody else is, on the outside looking in. I think that there's more people in this sport who have expressed concerns about that type of power structure that make me wonder if that's where we're headed.
Sam, you're a Houston guy. I'm sure the Cougs have been very interested in the happenings over the last week or so. What are your thoughts on Houston's position and really the AAC as a whole? Because they look like a conference that, you wait around long enough, you could devour the Big 12, you could join them. I mean, there's a lot of options out there on the table. They're playing wait and see too, but just your thoughts on the AAC and Houston's position in this in particular.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing about that conference is that they do seem to be in a little bit of a position of strength, not necessarily financially, but in stability, because they are not falling apart at the moment. And so their options, certainly Mike Oresco is going to try to poach some of those Big 12 teams that are left out there if he can. I don't know how realistic that is, but they're certainly going to try. And then the other option is maybe they pursue a merger, or maybe several of those teams come into an expanded Big 12 if the 8 remaining teams decide to band together. Houston is one of those teams that I think they're gonna be patient to see how this all breaks out and act accordingly. I don't think that it's a bad idea to have Baylor, TCU, Texas Tech, Houston, and SMU in a conference. That's more than half of the old Southwest Conference. And I'm a little old school. I grew up watching that league. But the idea, if you're not going to be in one of these big superpower leagues, then why not get some of those schools together? And it makes it a little bit more of a fun fan experience. It makes it drivable for, you can drive from Waco to Houston or Fort Worth to Waco, and, you can have some really fun, interesting matchups that brings back a little bit of the old flavor that we used to have in college football before money became the driving factor for everything. So that's one thing I would be interested to watch. But yeah, the American is certainly, I think, in a pretty decent position, whether it's an merger, adding teams, or some of them trying to latch on somebody else.
When you were covering A&M, especially, the high, days of the SEC, which, obviously were not that long ago, but could you ever imagine this scenario with Texas now joining them in the SEC, not to mention Oklahoma as well?
No way. No, I wouldn't have imagined it 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
It just, those two teams are tent poles of the Big 12. And I never thought that I'd see them leave to join another power conference where they're essentially kind of one of many, because they're joining some big boys with Alabama and Georgia and LSU. I thought because of the control they had, maybe it's something. I wasn't always necessarily think that the Big 12 would survive forever, but I definitely didn't foresee this. That said, I understand why they did it. And at the very least, at the very minimum, even though I think it's not necessarily the greatest impact on the sport as a whole, we are going to get some great football matchups. And me personally, as someone who grew up in the state of Texas, I am excited about seeing Texas and Texas A&M play it again. And I'm tired of hearing them people being asked, are they going to play? Are they not going to play? And hearing them bicker about each other and act like they don't care about each other when the fans know they really do, and they pay attention to everything that happens at the other program. So I'm glad that all that's going to come to an end. We're actually going to see them play on the field again, because that's the way it should be.
Sam, thank you. As always, appreciate your time. Sam Kahn Jr. from theathletic.com covers college football, also recruiting in Texas with us on SicEm365 Radio. The YouTube, the text line just blowing up. We'll get to that and some of you next. A quick break right here.